that in fact is an indication of the much greater degree of attention that these conflicts have drawn, and the major number of new issues that they raise also. The whole question of state stabilization is an important aspect of the UN's preoccupation today. And that is why, for example, we would have thought that after the end of the Cold War, there would be less a requirement for peacekeeping. In fact, there has been an increase in the number of peacekeeping operations. Today, there are 18 peacekeeping operations, and perhaps the budget of the Department of Peacekeeping is at an all-time high of almost $8 billion annually. And that itself shows that the UN is increasingly being involved in all kinds of approaches towards stabilization of situation within states. And that, I think, is an important factor of the relevance rather than the relative the irrelevance of the United Nations. Now, I think that important factor has to be borne in mind when you look at how the United Nations is perceived. Today in many parts of the world, the United Nations is perceived in terms of the role of the UNICEF, in terms of the role of the UNDP, in terms of the peacekeepers, in terms of the role of the WHO, in terms of addressing many of the issues that arise as a result of state stabilization. And I think that is an important area where the United Nations has established its relevance as an indispensable organization for a world that is increasingly globalized, that is increasingly connected, and that is increasingly conscious that you cannot sit by when you see major, let's say, problems of the attacks on human rights, grave and persistent violations of human rights taking place. This is not to suggest that that such things have not taken place with the UN, and the UN has had to bear the burden, the cross of having not done enough in Rwanda, not done enough in Srebrenica. But it is increasingly this aspect which is informing the councils in the United Nations, and increasingly you are seeing approaches by new institutions to prevent the deterioration of the situation in many parts of the world into major issues like you're seeing it in many parts of Africa, for example. Today, the United Nations is seriously involved all the way from Sudan, Somalia, Cote d'Ivoire, Congo, and each of these places, it would seem that the number of issues that have arisen may suggest that that things are not under control. But I think it is because we are doing so much that it's being raised. The basic problem, of course, of poverty is an important problem, and in that sense, I think developmental concerns are basically national concerns. But at the same time, I think for the first time, it is the United Nations which has uniquely identified the Millennium Development Goals as a shorthand for basic developmental concerns covering all countries at the root, that is the poverty reduction. Now, it is true that in comparative terms, if you take away China and India, poverty has actually increased. But the standards of poverty calculation have also changed. To some extent, that is also true. But it's for 1.25 today dollars per day rather than the $1 earlier, and it is in fact in a sense making allowances for the inflation and things like that. This is not to suggest that the concerns are not there. Today, one has to remember that you are looking at a changed world. The population of the world, the demography of the world has doubled. The population has doubled since the beginning, say the 50s. There are more people in slums. In fact, the urban population around the world is more than the entire population of the world in the 50s. So what you are seeing is a whole exponential development or change in the basic issues of poverty and development that the world is facing. This is not to suggest that not enough has been done. I mean, nothing has been done. The point is that with this vast growth of the population around the world, problems of addressing the problems of poverty have actually increased. And I think the UN, while it is doing a fair amount, is probably not doing enough. And it is from that point of view that the Millennium Development Goals have called upon, have actually focused on 8 basic targets which need to be addressed. Poverty, education, then empowerment of women, health, maternal health, and then of course finally the sanitation and environmental stabilization, if you will. Because if you notice today, with the doubling of populations, you are finding that in terms of the ecological footprint of the world, in terms of what an individual apparently today in the world is using up resources of more than 1.5 times, as it were, what the world can bear in terms of what it can replenish in a year. And from this point of view, that these are concerns which the UN, I think, is addressing. Now, the final point which I think you need to mention, and that is G20. I think despite the fact that there are organizations like the G20 which are coming up, essentially, I think it is the UN which provides the legitimization of any such multilateral process. It is the UN which provides the forum, because it's the UN which develops the norms and eventually provides the ultimate legitimization for any multilateral activity. The G20 will reflect the reality of the power of the world. Yes, it will suggest things, but ultimately I think it is for the 170 as well as the G20, the rest of the world, which will have to also be brought into the mainstream. And I think from that point of view, despite everything that the G20, of course, reflecting the real power around the world, it is ultimately in the UN that this will be legitimized. This is not to suggest that the UN doesn't need reform. In fact, it is the very changes that have taken place that call for basic reform in the United Nations in terms of decision making, in terms of looking at the way in which the UN should be a better reflection of the current world and not the reflection of the world of the 1945. I don't know if this provides any kind of
Absolutely. It's a very powerful explanation of the UN and its future. Let us shift to the universities for questions from that end. The ground rules are that we will go in the following order: first Lehigh, then Bronx, then Montclair, then Vancouver, then Teaneck, then Madison. Each university will ask 2 questions, and one after the other, and we will take both the answers to both questions together from this end. So over to Lehigh for their 2 questions.
Hello, Mr. Ambassador. You mentioned stabilizing states that were experiencing internal conflict. How would the UN handle an internal conflict when the legitimacy or morality of a government is questionable?
Okay, let's take the second question.
Hello, Mr. Ambassador. If we do want to strive for a more democratic rather than aristocratic institution in the UN, how possible or realistic is it that the Charter could be changed to remove the veto power of the permanent members?
Okay. So the first question is, what do we do about
the morality of leadership?
The morality of leadership, which is questionable in the best of countries. Whether they are democracies or dictatorships makes no difference. We've had very questionable leaders in democracies.
Yeah, morality, actually, this is the question really very often asked is, what kind of standards do you, is it for the outside world to determine what the morality of, or what the ethical standards of the functioning of any particular leadership in a country should be? Now, up to a point, when you posit democracy, you're automatically suggesting that it is for a society to determine its own leadership. And if it is done, the process is fine, then of course it is for the the leadership or that country to evolve its own set of standards of functioning, etc. Now, and ultimately it will